So I'll start out by introducing Eve. She's a senior researcher at txtLAB, a cultural analytics laboratory at McGill University. She graduated from McGill in 2017, oh, congratulations, with a BA in cultural studies. For her honors thesis, she analyzed patterns of linguistic contagion in contemporary plague fiction. It's very cool. Her current work at txtLAB applies machine learning and social network analysis to measures of cultural inequality with particular focus on issues of gender bias and intersectionality in recent texts. Andrew is professor and William Dawson Scholar in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at McGill University. His work focuses on using the tools of data science, machine learning, and natural language processing to promote a more inclusive understanding of culture and creativity. His research is grounded in the history of reading technologies and how they have shaped human cultures. He's the director of txtLAB, a cultural analytics laboratory at McGill, as I mentioned, and as well as editor of the new open access journal, Cultural Analytics, and the leader of the SSHRC-funded multinational partnership grant, novel text mining the novel. Thank you so much for joining us, and please take it away.
Thanks, Lauren. And we are going to be sort of jointly talking, so I'm going to kick things off, and then Eve will take over. As Lauren mentioned, we're from txtLAB, which is a cultural analytics laboratory at McGill University, where we try and use the tools of data science to think about literature and culture. So things that we've studied, we have a particular interest right now in questions of inclusivity, questions of access. So we've done projects on thinking about how can we value the work of fan fiction writers, for example, so getting past the publishing world or the gatekeepers of publishing and figuring out ways to celebrate the creativity of fans. We've done projects that try and reverse engineer literary prize committees to try and figure out biases or tendencies that this very sort of small elite world of literary prize giving has around it. And then we've also done projects that look at gender bias as well in book reviewing, so trying to figure out the whole publishing pipeline and where these effects kick in. So we've looked at ways in which women authors tend to be more associated with certain topics, which impacts obviously who can be an expert on what topics. And if you read the piece, you'll see the topics are very, very, it's as stereotypical as you can imagine. And so the research is really trying to uncover these things and pinpoint them, and also start a conversation around what we can do who are involved in publishing and to change things. The question that Eve and I are going to talk to you today about is just this larger one of how can we use a different kind of data than sales data to think about what's on your list. So the tools that we actually won't be really talking about are that we use are machine learning, natural language processing, social network data. That's the underlying methods that we're trying to apply to these problems. And one of the particular dimensions that we're really going to focus on here are characters. So characters are the backbone of storytelling. We're particularly interested in fiction, but I think it's also true for nonfiction. And so we start asking, what can you know about characters? Probably the simplest question you can imagine asking is, how many are there in a book? And it turns out the answer is about 89 in a given novel, which isn't a very interesting question or answer. But this is potentially a little more illuminating. This gives you an idea of the overall distribution of characters in a novel, who gets the most attention. It has a very familiar structure to you, so that the most important character is considerably more important than the next most important character. So on the x-axis, further left is your importance, so ranking from 1 down to the 89th character. The y-axis gives you an average number of mentions that character might experience in a book. And you see it tails off very, very quickly, so that after a few characters, pretty much there's a big long tail of very unimportant characters. And this can be useful to start to think about what kind of book you're writing, and what kind of social world you're constructing, and what kind of pattern are you reproducing. You could also start to ask questions, how connected are the characters in my book? What kind of social worlds am I imagining? And so, for example, this is a social network built off of a work of young adult fiction, which looks very different than a world of adult fiction. One is much more complex, socially dense, and bifurcate or has smaller communities in it. And that tells you something already that's going on in that genre, which you intuitively may have thought about, but this makes it very, very clear that one way that writing to these different genres targets different kind of social worlds. And there's obviously a lot more questions we could begin to ask there. Another question that we're going to focus on today is one of diversity. So how diverse are characters in your lists? And that's where I'm going to actually turn the mic over to Eve and lower it and give you that.
Thank you, yeah. I'm going to stand to the side a little bit because I'm quite small, so I can't see you guys over there. So there's a lot of questions that we can ask about diversity, and I think the panels earlier today have really shown us that. What we are focusing on for this presentation is looking at gender bias, and particularly how gender bias functions inside of these social networks. And we kind of take this to be a question about representation. So we know in terms of movies and TV shows, but also in our, as we heard from the panel, in terms of education or employment opportunities, that women just aren't often allotted the same space or the same power as cis men, and we wanted to see if this was the same in contemporary fiction. We think it's really important because books are a really important part of our own socialization, and this quote is from the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media. It says, "If she can see it, she can be it." So our jumping off point here is that the ways that women and girls operate inside of social networks has an effect on the way that we imagine our own experiences or our own limitations and the possibilities of what we could be. But in order to do this, we have to figure out how to build these networks. And the first thing that you have to do is you have to identify your characters. As a reader of a book, it's pretty straightforward for any of us reading to identify when we come across a character. But for a computer, those instances, those names are a lot more ambiguous. So we use a software that was developed by Professor Bamman at UC Berkeley. It's called Book NLP. And what it does is it runs through a book, and it'll identify a character name based on sentence position, a few other things, and then it'll count the number of instances of that character. So if you may have figured it out, but this is George R.R. Martin's Dance with Dragons, and we see Jon. That's Jon Snow. He's at the top. So those you have the names of all the characters, and then an aggregate of the counts. So that number that you're getting is the rate that John appears per 100,000 words. So those are instances of John, but also his nicknames or aliases, and also instances of he's or hims that were able to match back to John. So as Andrew mentioned, the average book is going to have a list that's about 89 lines long. And then we get a gender prediction, but I'll speak about that a little bit more in a second. Now, that gives us a sense of the characters, but it doesn't really give us any notion of how those characters are interacting. And in order to do that, we have to turn our books into social networks. To build a social network, you need two different things. The first is nodes. Nodes are just characters, and you were just looking at a nodes list. And the second is edges. Edges are interactions between characters. Interactions, it's pretty ambiguous what an interaction is, and it's a whole research question in and of itself, who is interacting in a book and what is qualified as an interaction. So for the purposes of this research, we use something called sentence co-occurrence, which effectively means if two nodes appear in the same sentence, that's an interaction. So you can see an example of what this ends up looking like as an output. So we have the still Game of Thrones, Rickon and Theon appear in the same sentence, and then in addition to who's interacting, name one and name two, we also do get some traction on the content of that interaction. So I think this first one's pretty great because we can see that Rickon and Theon are having a higher negative percentage, and that's because if you look at the verbs, we have things like murder and behead and lie. So you end up with something that can be hundreds, thousands of lines long because it's every single time two characters appear in a sentence. But I do want to introduce two really important shortcomings to our research before we go any farther. And the first is that you may have noticed we're only using men and women. So we are using the gender binary. We think gender identity is, of course, a lot more complicated than this, but men and women in fiction are highly identifiable categories. They do exist as social categories in fiction, and therefore we think it's really valuable to study them. There are, of course, research questions buried beneath this that we would want to address later, but it's something that we can study and that we see and therefore has an effect on social networks. The second is cultural bias. So when you are given a gender prediction, first the book NLP tries to match you to your pronouns and give you a prediction based on the pronouns that are associated with your name. But if it can't figure out your gender based on your pronouns for any number of reasons, it'll go to something called a guesseteer. And a gazetteer is effectively a name bank of common names attached to their common predicted genders. But as with a lot of things in computer science and in the world, this was created by traditionally white and Western Anglo conception of naming. So if you have a name that doesn't fit inside that bias, then you are much more likely to be misgendered or not given a gender. And I want you to keep those shortcomings in mind because we really do see our research then looking at these simple categories of men and women as a first pass, but certainly not the end of where this should go. But what we did find was really interesting just looking at these categories of men and women. So what we did was we took 1,370 novels from 2001 to 2015, and we built these social networks out of them. These crossed 7 genres, which you'll see in a second, and we measured for 2 different types of analyses. The first was looking at visibility, so just how likely are you to see a man or a woman in a given spot, and the second is looking more at network measures, so how are we seeing those characters interact. First on to visibility. The most simple question that you can ask when you're doing an analysis like this is, who's your main character? Turns out in only 39.6% of the cases, we have estimated that they are women. So this is not half. And it is worth noting here that we did have every single one of our characters labeled as either a man or a woman. You can see that that the genre does have an effect on this. So we have a low in YA of 32 up to a high in bestsellers of 45. But at none of these cases are we at 50, which we would imagine to be equality. The next thing that we looked at was top pairs. So that means the top 2 most mentioned characters. And the most common configuration of a top pair is to have a man in the first position, followed by a woman in the second. But as we're going to speak a little bit more about men and women interacting later, for the purposes of this slide, I really want to focus on the likelihood of having 2 men versus having 2 women. So 2 women was perhaps unsurprisingly the least common top pair configuration that happens in only 12% of our novels. And when you compare that to men, we see 2 really interesting things. First of all, it's much lower, so those are raw counts that you can see across your genres. So men are about, in this case, it's like 2.6-ish times more likely to appear as a top pair than 2 women. But also, with the exception of romance, we see this happening at almost an identical rate across all of our genres, which means this is not a function of this type of story that we are imagining to be inside of these books. It's just something about the way that top pairs are created. Romance is an exception because in our about 200 romance books, we only found 5 cases where there was 2 women in the top pair. So. Then we zoomed out, and now we're looking at all of our characters. And we find that if you look in the top 20 characters in every book, women make up about 35% of those characters. And this is really consistent across genres. We didn't see any difference in any of our genres. It's this almost weird rule of 35%. And the way that ends up breaking down across the ranks, so this is using a similar graph to the one that you saw earlier. We have our character rank on the x-axis, so that dotted line represents the top 20. And we have an orange line, which is men, the purple is women, and you see that the orange line never dips below the purple, meaning that whether you're looking at our count of characters in the first rank, the 3rd, the 50th, the 200th, there are always more men occupying that space than there are women. And this gives us a sense of what it looks like as a global issue, but when you look at that inside of individual books, we find other really interesting things. So when we compared all of the men to women per individual book, we found in 91% of our cases that there are more men. This does change based on what the book is, so you can see we have extreme cases on either end, but again, that 91% is telling us something about gender bias. I do want to point out ancillary justice because I think it's a really interesting test case and kind of gives us a sense of why looking at data can also inform storytelling and the way that we think about stories. Ancillary Justice is a sci-fi novel, and in the universe that Anne Leckie created, gender constructs don't exist, and therefore she uses female pronouns only throughout her entire book. So that's how we get to such an extreme of women. We just don't have gender. So going back, but we do have gender. And what we tried to do was, given the fact that we're seeing this really both the skew towards male characters, but also a really consistent skew across our genres. We kind of did away with genre labels and decided to instead look at, okay, how does author gender operate inside of these measures? So if we look instead of all of our authors, we look just at books written by women, can we break these rules? So whereas our main character, if we look at all authors, we have a predicted 39.6%. If we look at just women authors, it does go up, but only slightly to 42%. Top pairs, we go from 12% in all books to 20% in women authors. So we are seeing a change, but it's not that big. Same thing here. If we look at all of our books, the orange line never dropping below the purple. There's always more men than women. Just books written by women. Yes, these lines are closer together, but that orange line does not drop below the purple until the 192nd spot, I believe. And in that case, it's just because there's one woman and no men. So what we're seeing from all of those measures is in terms of visibility of women, they just don't occupy the same social space and social importance that men do in these stories. But again, this is just giving us some traction of who's in our network. So the next question we wanted to ask was, well, how does gender operate inside of these networks? How are we able to see the way that men and women interact? And the way that we did that is through a measure called gender assortativity. Assortativity is a score that's based on the number of pairs that are the same gender, both men and women, either a male-male pair or a women-women pair, and then that's compared to any mixed gender interaction. If your score is above 0, you can think of it as like birds of a feather flock together, and if it's below 0, it means you're more likely to be speaking to a man if you're a woman, or a woman if you're a man. It turns out in fiction, in every single case, we're always getting negative scores. This graph is a little bit complicated, so I'm just going to take a second to explain it. It's basically showing you the average scores of assortativity across all of our genres. So we did this test for every genre. Those are the 7 colors, across 3 different subsets. First looking at all of the characters, then just characters in the top 20, and then just those in the top 10. And those are what the clumps look like. And you can see 3 important takeaways here. The first is that it's all negative. So that means that in every genre, we are getting a negative score, meaning that they are more mixed genders. Authors are more invested in putting men and women together. We're calling this a heteronormative network. The second is that this heteronormativity is more pronounced the more important the characters are. So you can see that because the graphs are going down like this. So in the top 10, we have lower scores, so more heteronormativity. And the last thing is that, again, with the exception of romance, which kind of operates in a pretty wacky way in terms of gender, there is no significant difference across genres. So what this is suggesting to us is that whether you're picking up a mystery book or a sci-fi or a YA or a bestseller, they are all pairing women and men versus women and men together in remarkably similar ways. It's not about the content of the story or what the story is ostensibly telling you about or what the narrative arc is. It's about the ways that the networks are structured to pair people together. And then the last measure that I wanted to talk about is we were really interested in kind of understanding or getting back to these questions of what does this do to the narrative? Because a lot of what I've talked about is looking at the difference between counts in men and women. So this measure was an attempt to kind of understand the content of those interactions. So there's a theory in social network analysis called structural balance, and it basically suggests that if you're in a triangle, so if there's 3 of you interacting, that you can either be balanced or imbalanced. Balanced would be if everyone's getting along, or if there's a mutual enemy. If both of you don't like someone, then that's fine, I guess. And then in terms of imbalance, it's when nobody's getting along because you would definitely want to be out of that state, or when you have a mutual friend, you can think of that as being like put in between like 2 people who don't like each other. And we wanted to see, basically our hypothesis here is, do women, the number of women, impact the likelihood of a triangle being balanced or imbalanced? And it turns out it doesn't. We didn't find anything significant there, but the rates are pretty much the same, regardless of how many men and women you have in terms of balance versus imbalance. But what we do see here happening in a very pronounced way is our most common triangle type is 1 woman and 2 men. That's the light orange bars. And the smallest likelihood of a triangle by a long shot is to put 3 women together. So letting 3 women interact, it doesn't happen very often in books. And so there are 3 main findings that I would like you to take away from this. And the first is that contemporary fiction favors characters that are men, and it favors mixed-gendered interactions. The second is that this is really consistent across genres. It's not about the way that the stories, like the marketing labels of these stories, it's about the actual ways that their social networks are structured, whether it's a YA or, as we saw, which are technically structured quite differently. They all kind of look the same. And the third thing is that you can't just add more women authors. That doesn't actually solve the problem all the way. Yes, of course, that does shrink these numbers and these gaps, but it doesn't actually solve the problem in and of itself. And I think what this is all suggesting is kind of that these are really sticky norms. There's something somewhere in the publishing pipeline that's creating these standards and these norms of how we think men and women should interact and how many women we should put in a book. And it's one thing for us to say as researchers, like, yeah, this is a problem and this exists. It's a whole other set of questions to figure out why and how and where. But we really do think it's important because it does affect a lot of what we think about books. And I'm going to pass it back to Andrew to tell you why.
So yeah, as part of our performance here, I'm going to switch back and give you a little bit more exploratory stuff. So that Eve was presenting the work that is, to our minds, pretty unambiguously signaling to readers something that I think most of us would agree isn't great, and that we really need to theorize, what can we do about these things? I'm going to show you some more exploratory. If you're wondering, okay, there's a problem, we want to try and solve that, what could we do that might be a little more creative or tap into kind of more specific questions about characters, about types of characters, about matching types of characters to things that readers are interested in. So this part is less, we have fewer answers here and a lot more questions. But one thing you might do, so what we can do now is think about character semantics, which is the language that is associated with a given character on a page in a book. And we can start aggregating those representations by groups or into groups. We can either do it in a supervised way where we say, okay, let's take all of our identified male characters and put them together, and all of our identified female characters, put them together, and see if there are distinctive differences between how they're being represented on the page. And what does that tell us? And then we can start to do this in an unsupervised way where we say, well, let's just discover some character types. What kind of clusters of characters are out there? So the first step we did, and I have a slide where I'll give you the answers, but I'm pretty sure you can guess it yourself. One of these groups, one of these word clouds belongs to men and one belongs to women. And interestingly, men tend to be more embodied according to the words that we're discovering here, which kind of came as a surprise to me if you think about research that's been done on the way women are represented in, say, film or something like that. Women tend to be much more communicative and emotive. And again, we see with things like husband and wife showing up in the opposite bins, this idea of heteronormativity, just how straight contemporary fiction seems to be when it comes to gender and characters. That care figure there is an example of how women are more often going to be in sentences with other characters than men are. And that's what we mean by this idea of communicative and sociable. So they're in these kind of social, they're implicated with other characters much more often than men are. So here are the answers. And then I couldn't resist doing my daughter's favorite icon, where she goes, "Daddy, it was never a dress, it's a cape." Got it. So there's that. This one, Eve told me I shouldn't show because it doesn't make any sense. I'm not good with graphics. If you're wondering where all the cool graphics came from, they're from Eve. But what I wanted to draw attention to, so what are those arrows? So this is what's called a biplot. And all it is a way of trying to figure out, when you're thinking about variables and thinking about observations, which variables, which features are making my observations, in this case my characters, move around in this character space. And what the arrows indicate are features that we're trying to identify that we think might be interesting either for you or for readers, and how they relate to characters. So we have things like interiority and embodiment, the extent to which characters seem to be introspective and thoughtful, the extent to which characters are being described in a physical way, the extent to which characters in affect or emoting, sociability, how often are they in a relationship with another character, communicativeness, how talkative are they. So this is just a small sample of variable space that we're trying to develop, and what you see is characters get sort of pushed around in this space based on these features, and we've color-coded it by gender. And there's not much signal there right away, which is good. That's actually a good thing that we're seeing. And what you can do with this then is you can say, okay, let's just kind of create an open kind of clustering exercise here using these features. Sorry, I do need my notes. Use an algorithm that said, okay, we estimate there are probably about eight clusters in here, and that's what those colors mean. These dots tell you nothing, but we can kind of break them out and say, okay, what kind of groupings are happening here? And so I've taken two examples it's from the same plot. So one on the far left is a group, and one on the far right is a group, again from the same set of overall possible space. And I couldn't resist, I'm an academic, so wherever we get to use the word phenomenology, it feels like a win. What does that mean exactly? Well, those are characters in novels by people like Jonathan Franzen, Jan Martel, Stephen King, E.L. James, where the character is highly centralized, so very strongly focused on a single main character, embodied, so there's something going on in terms of how they're being physically described, but also they're very cogitative and perceptive. As I say, they're observing lots of things, and then what they tend to observe are the embodiment of other people. That's why my tendency to use the fancy word of phenomenologist. There's something about these characters, there's a lot of focalization going on around what they're seeing and feeling. Whereas on the other hand, you have this sort of what we call the sociables. Catherine Stockett's The Help, Mary Higgins Clark, James Patterson. And these are very different types of characters. So they are negatively indicative by their centrality and their agency in a novel, and much more by their sociability, being paired off with other characters, interacting with other characters, being objects of things happening in a novel. They're much less central. They're much less the doers of the novel, and they're also more physically described. It's just a brief indication of the way that these models can start to begin to group your books in ways that might be intuitive and interesting from a reader's perspective. So we're going to wrap up so you can actually have some time for questions and Q&A if you want to ask about things that we've put together and presented here. And the kind of one big takeaway that I was thinking about on the way over here was, why are we doing this? And I think our aim is to think about how we can use data to get this bigger picture of publishing, and think about when we publish books, we're holding up a mirror. We're holding up a mirror to the world of how it either is, might be, or is not. Data can make us very self-conscious about this. It can make us much more self-aware about the things that we're doing that we might not otherwise be aware at an aggregate level that's very hard to understand. It can also do something at the granular level. It can really, when we're talking about, well, this is a problem, what do we do about it? Data can be very useful in saying, well, look, if you adjust just these few words, or if you adjust just these few characters, if you change these numbers around, and it's really not about, it's not synonyms, if only swap in this word instead of that word. When you start to change your vocabulary, you're really changing plots, you're really changing social structures, you're really changing what a book can be about. And that starts to add up, and data can really help us pinpoint where those small changes might need to be in order to break down these patterns, to break down the really familiar things that women tend to emote and feel and men tend to have chests and nod. We feel like that is a world we can hack, that there's something we can do, and data can kind of get us there. And so instead of kind of reproducing the biases that we know already exist, right, we're generating books that kind of imagine things as we haven't seen them before. So thank you very much.
So when we're talking about sort of creating change and having more diverse books, where do you think, just as a general question, the response
you want me to answer?
You were in
Okay.
publishing.
I was an intern for one summer.
More than me.
I think you can't really, I don't think the onus can be on one group. I think that's the same with any of these issues that are obviously systemic, is that you have to tackle it from as many angles as you possibly can get. So editors, yes. Publishers, yes. Having access to data, researchers who are who are asking these questions. All of these things have to work together in order to fix these monolithic structures that are doing kind of everything they can to keep things the way they are, which I don't think they should be. I think we need to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, when people work in advocacy to really get these changes to happen, a lot of it is just consciousness raising. I think it's these very unconscious, latent things that reproduce themselves. And once you're sort of faced with it, you think, oh yeah, well, as an editor, if I have a manuscript, it's actually probably pretty hard for me to keep all the characters in my head. But it wouldn't be that hard to develop a tool that I can quickly say, oh, wait a minute, I've got a 60-40 split again. Editor's note to author. Can you fix this? Right? And I think that the talk this morning about the things that we can do today already in order to change these micro practices such that things really filter out. And if authors aren't bringing that to the table, if they're subconsciously thinking to get this thing published, I need to have this, my characters look in a certain way, so that editors can signal back, no, that's not actually our goal. We didn't realize that was happening. So it has to happen in all these kind of nodes, I think.
Yeah.
So this could be super useful when you add a tool like this. So is this like something that's like on a website that say an editor could go and plug their manuscript into and like chug out your statistical response and then be like, I should finish this now. Like, or do they have to go and individually count?
I don't count individually.
It does not exist as a piece of software. This is all stuff we write. Eve writes in the lab, and I write in the lab, and we develop and test and try and figure out. I think one of the things we're trying to figure out is there enough interest to take the trouble? There's a big difference between writing some code for yourself to test something and writing code such that somebody who doesn't know how the code works can use it, on a day-to-day basis. And so what we're trying to figure, what we really want to also hear is, yes, if I had that, I would really appreciate it, and I could do X, Y, and Z. I could imagine these things. That's a conversation we're also looking to try and start as well for us to get a sense of demand and interest.
Are you trying also to work from there and expand your research a little bit further in order to extract deeper information like group age or places where the character comes from or things like that? Do you have any plans for it?
We got a lot of plans.
We
What are our
have
plans?
many plans. We have too many plans. That's really our problem at the lab. Yeah, it's a lot harder. You can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that gender signal is really easy to identify because you have these pronouns. So when you're doing a first pass, I think often in computer science, and this is a problem in and of itself that I kind of hinted at, it's really easy to look at men versus women. But things like we've talked actually about age, children versus adults, race and class are really important ones that we want to be able to add to this type of research. But it becomes a lot more complicated to start extracting those features because they don't have the same pronoun tags that gender does. We're working on some tools to try and figure out if we can do this, and we have big plans, but, right? We always have big plans. But yeah, no, of course, those are things that we really hope to touch on because they nuance these categories. We were just saying men and women, but there's so many women operate in so many different ways. Men as well have different identities that matter in terms of, everything. That's good.
Is there any time sequence stuff? Like, is gender parity getting better or worse over time?
So my colleague has done some of that with a longer historical point of view, and what was he finding? He was finding that authorship there's this plummet moment that happens in the sort of late modernism, 1950s post-war period, where women just as authors really drop out of the picture. They've recovered massively in the last 10, 20, 30 years, since like the 90s, I feel like. So that story changed, so that's a real positive. But if you've ever wondered why on your university syllabus it was dominated by one group or another. There's actually a very strong historical reason for what, no one's quite sure why it happened, but there's a moment in time where women are writing about as much, I'm talking in the case of fiction, as much fiction as men are in the 19th century, and then all of a sudden just whoosh, some these get totally taken out of the picture. In terms of characters, over time they're getting more and more similar to each other, men and women are in novels. So that was also a sort of, when we're talking about gender, not thinking about it as a binary, but as a set of options and vocabulary, what seems to be happening is they're starting to sound more and more like each other. And that's something we're also thinking about investigating. Like, what does that mean, actually? But that's, that's the sort of big picture. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, and one of the things we're able to show is that having, and this goes back to the historical question as well, having more women write books changes the representation of gender in books. Like, that much we definitely know. The part that kind of freaked us out, that we were pretty surprised by, was that it still, the structural inequalities don't actually go away with that. So that's not the only solution. So the only, adding more women to your list isn't going to fix this problem. And that was for us a real light bulb moment that something else was going on. But understanding gender and other kinds of diversity on your authorial lists also really matters, absolutely. Yeah. You want to talk about?
So the numbers that we showed you are actually adjusted values. We didn't get into like the background of how of like the margin of error, but what we did was I hand validated samples, and then from those samples that are hand validated, I catch the errors because I go into the books and figure out where the misgendering is happening, and we do find that based on that sample, that the algorithm that we're using does overpredict men slightly. So every number that we present to you uses a prevalence, like do you want it, like if
It's basically like a technique in epidemiology. If you're trying to assess the prevalence of a disease, and you catch it with a certain percentage, and you have error rates of detecting it, you can sort of say, all right, given those amounts of error, and I think I've observed this much of this phenomena, in our case, women or male characters, we'll adjust those numbers based on how much error is in that prediction. So the plus or minus on that 39%.
that's the adjusted value.
Yeah, but there's a confidence interval on there that's probably a couple percentage points. So we estimate that number for protagonists at least would swing a little bit. Once you get into a lot of characters, we can be more certain that 35% number, which mathematically just is the magic number. It's the 2 to 1. Right? When you see 35%, the thing it tells you is you're always getting 2 men for every woman. And that number has a very small margin of error because it's being done on a lot of characters. Yeah. That's a great point. Vita and Swilla were 2 big inspirations for us in this kind of research. If you don't know them, by the way, Vita and Swilla, one is an American, one is a Canadian version of a group of women artists who got together to assess women in the arts. And they do this thing called The Count every year, where they just go through book reviews and figure out how many women are in the bylines, how many women did reviewing, and how many women got reviewed. And they showed early on that those numbers are not even close to equal. And then they name titles, they give titles amounts. And some titles have changed. You can see them grow over the years to approaching parity. And some have just decided, like, oh, I don't care. I'm the Times Literary Supplement. That's the one.
Men only.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just wondering with all of this, you didn't look at any sales data, right? So my question that comes is, how do we foster more representation? It's very easy to take at some point we can take your data and sales data, and suddenly we are an industry based on sales, and say, well, actually, it's 3 men sell 3 times better. How do we stop that?
Is that?
How do we actually
I mean,
representation?
my reaction as someone who's in academia is like, so what? It sells better. Like, I know that's the wrong, but I think there's a difference between saying we do away with all of our bestsellers and saying, how do we reimagine what a bestseller could be? And I think that is, so if we say, okay, we know that these books are consistently selling, and they have all men, then okay, we understand that, but do we, I guess this is a question back to you, like, are we okay with that? And like, if we're not, how do we do that and still have profitable organizations or publishing houses? There has to be some way to interact with those 2 things. Do you want to jump in on that?
Well said. To add, Hollywood has done some of these self-assessment exercises, and women are historically underpaid and underrepresented in directorial roles, et cetera, and yet when you look at the movies' average gross sales and those kinds of things, movies directed by women or with women in starring roles tend to do, on average, better. So, my intuition is it's also not going to work out that way. That is to say, these norms probably are not sales-driven. And that they're, again, these kind of latent, weird, sticky practices. So.